Morning, everyone. For those that have, you can go and get a coffee. You can probably hear me back there as well. There's coffee and tea in the back if you want to have it. This session is on corporate social responsibility. For those who were in the last session, you know who I am. I'm the Timothy Devinney. I'm the Pro Dean Research. We're going to have three speakers. Leonidou is going to be the first speaker. I will be the second speaker, so I'm monitoring myself, which is always bad news. And the third speaker is Effie Kesidou. The topic is on social responsibility, which is something which at the business school is actually quite a, let's say heavily researched topic, but it's one that spans almost all of the areas of the school. We've got people across every part of the school, from operations, economics, accounting and finance, international business, marketing, management, and areas of management, all kind of working on this topic, work employment as well. So without much further ado, I'll turn over to Kostas. The rules probably about 15 minutes each. And then if we have enough time, we can sort of kind of open up to questions towards the end. So I'll just turn over to Kostas.
Thank you very much, Dean. All right, good morning, everyone. Lovely day, isn't it, today? Now, they asked me to stay here at the podium, which is very not like me because I like to walk around. So I'll try to do it from here. My name is Kostas Leonidou. I'm a professor of marketing at Leeds University Business School. And today I'm going to talk to you about values. About sustainability. And we're going to go through how important these values are within society and what kind of impact these values might have when it comes to sustainability, attitudes and behavior. Before we go any further, sustainability is a mega trend today. We have seen, we are witnessing dramatic changes in the natural environment, in society, and awareness and interest on sustainability is on the rise for the past 3 decades or so. And there are a number of sustainability problems today that are quite important. For instance, global warming, child labor, etc., etc. All these are important for organizations, but also within societies. And it's very important for us to understand the motives, to understand what drives citizens to engage in sustainable behavior, to live a more sustainable life. So we need to understand what ticks these citizens in order to design effective marketing strategies and programs to target these individuals. Looking at the literature, and this is a project that I'm working on with colleagues from other universities. We try to look at value systems. We understood that values play a big role in how consumers, how citizens form their attitudes and behave. And basically within, what is a value system? A value system is defined as an enduring organization of beliefs concerning preferred modes of conduct or end states along an important continuum. Okay? And when it comes to values and beliefs, we need to understand that these values are enduring. They have a macro focus, and they play a very important role in how individuals live their life, how individuals go about and do their everyday activities, make decisions about their children, make decisions about the environment, make decisions about purchasing products, etc., etc. So it's very important to understand the hierarchy. When it comes to personal values, we have personal values, and these help us shape attitudes, and then these values lead to behavior. So that's the idea that we're actually focusing on with this project. When you look at the literature, you also find out that there are different value systems in place. For instance, in the sustainability literature, according to Sturt and Associates, there are 4 different values. For instance, biospheric or altruistic values, egoistic values, openness to change, and conservation. And if you look at these values, they pretty much resemble the Schwartz values that was published in 1992. Also, we have culture as an important factor shaping attitudes and behavior within this area. But beyond the generic value systems, there are also specific value systems, systems that can guide individual behavior, such as materialism, such as generativity, such as familiality or religiosity. All these factors, for instance, materialism, the degree of importance and centrality attached to possessions, generativity, future orientation, and the belief about the future impact of actions, religiosity, how important religion is in an individual's life, but also familiality, how important is family life to the individual. When it comes to sustainability attitudes, the literature is, contains dozens of studies on the subject. And in many cases, they try to look at how an individual that is interested in sustainability, in other words, has a positive, a favorable attitude towards sustainability, how does this favorable attitude translate to purchasing behavior, translate to buying more sustainable products, green products, buying fair trade coffee, for instance. Now, we know that this has already been examined in the literature, and there are a number of studies. But what has not been examined is how sustainability attitude might have an impact on an individual's activistic behavior. Whether an individual will support causes, will provide donations, will join environmental and social groups, non-governmental organizations. But most importantly, what is the impact of sustainability attitudes and activism on quality of life? Because there have been a number of cases, a number of arguments about how sustainability can contribute to an enhanced life satisfaction, to an enhanced quality of life. And we know that quality of life is very important today because, some employers, for instance, they choose their headquarters, they choose where to invest based on the quality of life because they want a happy workforce. They want people that feel better about their lives to join and work for their organizations. Now, from looking at the literature, we understood that there are a number of gaps, okay? The first gap is that there was no sufficient understanding about the role of specific values in shaping sustainability attitudes. On top of that, when you look at the measurement, there are studies that focus on social attitudes or environmental attitudes, but very few studies look at sustainability as a concept that goes into different dimensions. And then, when it comes to the attitude purchasing behavior link, most studies have looked at the impact at the micro level when it comes to, for instance, buying products, shopping from specific brands, for instance, but they haven't looked at the impact on activism and life satisfaction. So our study aims to look at these issues. Specifically, we want to examine values, okay, as drivers of sustainability attitudes and explore the impact of these attitudes on activism and quality of life. So we devised a conceptual model where as a central element of this model, of this idea, is sustainability attitudes, okay, environmental and societal attitudes. And then we look at value systems. First, generativity. The more generativity a person has as a value, the higher the effect on environmental and societal attitude. The opposite for materialism. The more materialistic an individual is, the less sustainable the individual will be in terms of attitude. When it comes to religiosity, the literature is mixed. Some people say that there are positive relationships here. Some other people say there are negative relationships here. So we argue for a positive relationship with environmental attitude and a negative relationship with environmental attitude and a positive with societal attitude. When it comes to familiarity, the literature says that it's important for individuals to have family in their values, and if you have family as a value, you know, the companion, the importance of family life, then these individuals will be more interested in sustainability because they will care about future generations. They care about the well-being of their children. And then when it comes to the outcomes of attitudes, we hypothesize here a positive effect between attitudes, a positive link between attitude and activism, both in the environmental and societal level. And then finally, we try to argue for a positive relationship between activism and quality of life. So to explore these and test this conceptual model, we try to gather data from 4 different countries. First, we gather data from the US to establish a base model and then compare it with models that we can establish in 3 other countries: Austria, China, and India. In most cases, we use online panels to collect data. You can see that for the US sample, we have 541 US citizens. For the Austrian sample, we have 561 consumer responses. For China, we have 305, and for India, we have 295. We used a questionnaire, okay, an online questionnaire, to collect data and try to understand what they think about the variables that we have in our conceptual model. As one of the problems with doing research internationally is that of measurement equivalence and that of language. So in that case, for instance, we needed to be very careful in terms of translating the questionnaire that was originally developed in English and then testing that in China and India. And we needed to do a double translation in order to allow for the meaning not to be distorted when focusing on different countries. Now, I'm not going to bore you with statistics. This slide says that everything was fine in terms of measurement. We have no problem with, with discriminant and conversion validity. But I'm going to skip to the results, which is the interesting aspect in this presentation. So don't get lost. I'm going to guide you through this. Okay? First, environmental attitudes. What are the drivers of environmental attitude? According to this slide, in the US sample, we have generativity as a positive link with attitudes in the US sample, materialism, negative link, religiosity, negative link, okay? Which was according to what we expected. However, we found no effect of familiarity with environmental attitude in the US sample. Now, if we look at the other samples, you will see that when it comes to generativity, the effect is quite stable in every country. So generativity is very important in driving environmental attitudes for individuals. Materialism was found to be significant in the Austrian sample, which is also a developed country, but it was not significant in the developing countries, for instance, China and India. And then when it comes to familiarity, we found that there was no link in the US sample, but familiarity was very important in other contexts, such as Austria, China, and India, as you can see from the results over there. More or less the same pattern emerges for the societal attitude, with the exception of religiosity, that we found a negative link between religiosity and societal attitude on this particular occasion. And we can explore that further on in Q&A when we ask questions later on. When it comes to attitude and activism, we found a significant link for both environmental and societal attitudes with environmental and societal activism in all countries, with the exception of the Chinese sample. Everything else was significant. And when it comes to activism, we found a very strong link between environmental and societal activism with quality of life. Now, to summarize, what we found is that generativity, materialism, and religiosity play a big role in how consumers in the US shape and develop attitudes towards sustainability. But there was no effect of familiarity in the American sample. Another thing that we found with this study is that generativity seems to be a very important factor in every context that we examine this particular variable. And then when we look at familiarity, it seems to be really important, not in the US, but in other countries such as Austria, China, and India. Materialism is very important in developing countries, but not very important in it's not important in developing countries, but it's not important in developed countries. And when it comes to activism, we found out that it's really important for individuals to do something, to be active first, and then that activism contributes to a better way of life, contributes to an improved satisfaction about their life, contributes to a higher quality of life. And that's the message that we want to send with this investigation, that sustainability has an impact on quality of life. In terms of implications, what we can extract from this research is that a one-size-fits-all approach is not something that we can go in every country. We need to understand what goes on in every country in terms of attitudes, in terms of values, in terms of how consumers and citizens behave, and then understand what values are important in every given context. So a standardized segmentation approach is not something that we suggest based on the results. When it comes to marketing and communicating sustainability from a public policy perspective, perhaps we need to think about how we can emphasize the message that sustainability can have an impact on how individuals live their life in terms of quality, in terms of life satisfaction. But one of the reasons of doing this specific talk, for instance, is to understand what we're doing, okay, to identify possible collaborations. And this is a call from myself, calling for more research between different disciplines on this important theme. For instance, we can look at the results and collaborate with sociologists, psychologists, okay, linguistics departments, but also people from the School of Earth and Environment to work together to understand these aspects on a different level, on a joint level between these different disciplines, to understand why these values are important in this way, to understand the specifics and how we can develop further these specific values, for instance. And then it's also important to look at big data in this particular subject, because one of the main problems is the attitude-behavior gap, okay? So we have a problem there in terms of understanding what people say they will do, their intention, and then the actual behavior, which in many cases is something different. So with big data, we can actually do that through, for instance, from the Consumer Data Research Center that we have here at the University of Leeds. We can look at how individuals make their purchases and then survey them to understand whether these are consistent with their attitudes or not. And if not, if yes, then to see what happened, why there is a deviation between their attitude and behavior in this way. That's it for me. Thank you, everyone. We can have questions at the end. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much, Tim.
Okay, my talk is going to be a little bit different. What I'm going to do is not talk about a single research project, but I'm going to talk about a set of things which has been done over quite a long period of time, a lot of which is in a book I wrote with a series of co-authors called The Myth of the Ethical Consumer. And I've titled this talk sort of Ethical Vanities, Why We Are Not as Good as We Say We Are. which gets to the point that Costas was bringing up, which is related to the attitude-behavior gap. So it's basic logic here, okay? The logic of a lot of what I have done over over a number of years started around thinking about things like corporate social responsibility. And what was for many years an enormous disconnect between the expectations of social responsibility on the part of the corporations without talking about the human components of the corporations. And effectively to back away from this idea that there is corporate social responsibility without the human components doing things. So in this sense, a lot of what we discuss in the book and a lot of what we discuss in a number of our articles is various responsibilities. So when you think about corporate social responsibility, you can think about managerial social responsibility. You can think about worker social responsibility. You can think about the social responsibility of the investors, the social responsibility of the customers, in this case, consumer social responsibility. And you can boil this all the way down to individuals, and that is individual social responsibility. So there are a number of terms that we coined over the years, one of which was consumer social responsibility. So moving away from this discussion of ethical consumerism to talk about consumer social responsibility. But also fundamentally this issue that if you look at the components, and this is something I'll talk about, if you looked at all the parts of this, you actually find that most of the parts don't behave in the ways that they expect the corporations to act. And this is what I'll talk about. And one of the real questions, of course, is, well, why? Why might that be the case? And whether there's actually a cheap and easy solution to that. Here's where we started. This goes back many, many years ago. So I put these quotes up, and I'll just read them for you. According to LOHAS is basically a sustainability research group which surveys people. In 2006, 30% of the U.S. adults, more than 63 million customers, now purchase goods and services with a nod towards the product's health, environmental, social justice, sustainability. The marketplace worth $227 billion is expected to expand till it reaches $1 trillion by 2020. An article in the Journal of Marketing, 70% of respondents believe that a firm's business ethics has some influence on their purchasing decisions. If you look at the first part of this, you would actually say, well, why aren't companies falling over themselves 10 years ago doing this? And in fact, Walmart was a classic example where they decided that they were going to go fully organic in a lot of their foods, right? And basically what happened was after a year of attempting to do this, they found that the customers didn't come, and they retrenched on that activity. In the second case, 70% of respondents believe that a firm's business ethics has something influence on their purchasing decisions. But the real question, of course, is, well, if 70% of consumers are doing this, why aren't 70% of the products mapping onto this? And we'll come back to this, because this is really the attitude-behavior gap. In other words, what people say on surveys doesn't translate very readily into what it is that they do when they actually are put in constrained environments, okay? And this is basically the issue that we face. Most ethical products typically do not become mainstream. They become niche products within specific categories. And so the question would be, well, if the consumers are so overwhelmingly in line with this model of the world, then why aren't the companies aligning to this in any real material way? So let me give you an example of this. How many people here have heard of the Good Samaritan experiments? Okay, one person, John. Basically, the Good Samaritan experiments were done in the 1970s. The paper was published in 1976. And what the Good Samaritan experiments were is a set of experiments which were done in New Jersey, where they invited a bunch of seminarians, people who were studying to be priests, to come to the university like this and say, we would like you to give an ethics presentation on the parable of the Good Samaritan. And the Good Samaritan, for those that don't know it, is a parable related to an individual who was robbed on the road to Jericho, and the Good Samaritan stopped and helped. Okay, so it's meant to be a parable about helping others. When the seminarian, when the priest in waiting came to the university, like you would come here, they come to the Great Hall and they say, oh, no, 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 no. There'd be a researcher there saying, no, 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 it's not, the lecture isn't in this building, it's in the business school, and you have 5 minutes to get there, 15 minutes to get there, 30 minutes to get there. Okay? So the first thing they do is they say, you've got to now go from point A to point B. But then when they got to the business school building, there was an actor who was in front of them who fell down and said, please help me, I'm ill. And the dependent variable was how many of them stopped. Okay? Here's the data. When there was no rush, in other words, they're told, you got 30 minutes to get there, no problem, 63% of them stopped. God only knows what the other 37% were doing. Okay? Remember, these are priests. These are people who are studying to be priests. Okay, but priests don't have a good reputation anymore, but that's okay. When they were in a moderate hurry, that dropped to 45%. And when they were in a real hurry, the number drops to 10%. Okay? So what's this tell you? Well, it basically tells you that even when these priests are going to talk about the Good Samaritan, they're talking about a parable of helping others. If you put a time constraint on them, they will basically step over a dead body to get to the end. And this is exactly what Darley and Batson say, right? In other words, literally some stepped over the victim on their way to the next building, okay, when they had the time constraint, okay? What varied here? Only time. Ethics didn't vary, right? Nothing else varied. And they tried other things, looking at this. They found exactly the same thing. Similar ones, Stanford prison experiments. What was found in the Stanford prison experiments, you give people a job. The job is you're a prisoner. They behave like prisoners. Your job is to be a guard and guard prisoners. They became abusive and they became like guards. Okay? Study after study after study shows this. In a corporate environment, there's a whole series of studies by Adam Galinsky that looked at what happens when you give managers power. What do you think happens? They abuse it. Okay? And they think actually that they are smarter and better and more competent than the people they abuse, that they abuse the power. But they're actually not. They're randomly assigned into conditions. This creates a real problem. Okay, and here's my sustainability variant to this, which is Dilbert. Okay, most people know Dilbert cartoons, right? Person comes to the boss's office, says we should show more corporate social responsibility. Boss says, okay, I'll cut your salary and give extra money to poor people. Okay. No, I was hoping we could hose the stockholders, not me. But that would hurt my stock options. So what if we pollute less? Yes, that's what I'm talking about. We could pollute less. Okay, take a bud to the river and see how much of our sludge you can get out. He said, where should I put it? And then at the end says, is it just me or has the coffee gotten better here? Okay, which explains the Love's Cafe coffee, by the way. But the main point of this is that none of this is free, right? There's trade-offs here. In other words, it's somebody paying a trade-off game in some sense, right? In other words, that it's a competition in some sense over values, over who pays, who gets the benefits, and so on down the line. Okay, and this is a big issue. This is an issue which arises in terms of the reality and not the kind of idealistic view of social responsibility. So what we need is we actually need, and this is where our study started, was an understanding of the individual behavior. Okay, in other words, what are the trade-offs that individuals are willing to make when they are forced into making trade-offs? And you can sort of say, well, we should put them in a world in which there are no trade-offs, but that's not life. And where there are costs to behavior, and the consequences of those behaviors may not be known to the individuals. All right? And this is actually quite a difficult task. In some sense, as a researcher, I became involved in this partially because I was working with a lot of nonprofit organizations and others, but also because it's actually an intriguing problem. In other words, how do individuals make these, we know how individuals make trade-offs when they purchase products and they do other things. But how do they really make trade-offs in terms of the nature of their values? So why do we need this? Well, one is that basing corporate and social policy on anecdote and opinion lacking scientific evidence doesn't work. Go back to what Costas was saying. If you go out and you do a survey and 70% of people come back and say, yeah, they'll love it if it's environmentally sustainable, and what you do is you provide it, it costs 10% more or costs 3% more, and they don't purchase it. Right? It's costly and inefficient. It can lead to bad policy in services, bad policy in a government standpoint. It can be dangerous socially because it implies that if it's socially regulated, it's one individual set of values that would essentially be imposed upon the rest of society, independent of what the cost of those impositions are. So what we did is we started looking at how we might study this. And we did lots and lots and lots of things. But I just want to show you a couple examples, not to kind of prove anything, but to get you to think a little bit. Okay, so what we did here is we looked at the willingness to pay or the willingness to act. So what we did is we surveyed people. So we asked people what matters in purchasing for you. Brand, people paid enough to live on when they're making the product, damage to the environment, animal testing, the human rights record in the country of production, right? And this is actually a quite famous survey. When we did this more than 10 years ago, this was a very famous survey done by the Maury Polling Organization in which they were arguing that people will want to purchase things. So what we did is we looked at this data. We surveyed a large number of people, and we basically here are looking at the extremes. So the utilitarians are people like MBA students. What do they care about? They care about the brand, they care about the environment a little bit, and they don't really care about much anything else, right? 3% care people are paid enough to live on. The anti-utilitarians are the people who are responding to the survey saying, we care about the environment, we care about the workers, we care about human rights, we care about the little animals, and we don't care about the brand. All right? If this translates into purchasing, then what you'd expect is you'd expect that the anti-utilitarians would skew towards products which have those attributes, and the anti-utilitarians would simply skew away from them. What happens, I'll skip that part, what happens when you look at how they actually engage in purchasing when you put them in experiments in which they actually have to purchase products with different characteristics, and what you find, and these are the characteristics of the products. So the products basically are child labor free, dangerous working conditions are in or out, minimum wages are paid, animal testing, products are biodegradable, etc. You actually look at those two groups and you don't see a difference. Basically, the people who tell you that they care don't behave any differently from the people who tell you they don't care. Okay? The Economist picked this up back in, I think, 2006, maybe 2008, and they titled the article they wrote about this, those dirty, lying consumers. In other words, what the consumers were saying wasn't related to what it was they were actually doing. And in fact, there's some evidence that we showed in the paper that was published on this, that the people who tell you they don't care are telling you the truth. The people who tell you they do care are actually telling you something which is kind of more idealistic. Okay? There's something else going on here. Maybe they do care. Maybe they think they care. But they don't necessarily actually care. This has been confirmed, for example, by studies of slacktivism. So individuals who are likely to tweet or use Facebook to express outrage on something are actually the least likely people to act in social contexts. A second example of this is related to a purchasing context in which individuals couldn't get good attributes. Okay, so what we did in this experiment was individuals could purchase products, but the products didn't either had trade-offs or didn't have trade-offs. So, for example, you could purchase an athletic shoe that maintained its quality, but it also didn't have, it was done in good labor practices environment. And what you see is you see the demand curve. This is the top one. The top one basically is the demand curve. As the price of the product goes up, people purchase less of the product. You'd expect that. But what happens in an environment in which, to get the ethical product, they actually have to give up something of the functionality of the product. So they have to give up a little bit. And that's the second graph, which is basically down here, and that is demand collapses. So as soon as you put the individual in a set of circumstance, in other words, if you can give them the ethics for free, then you get a normal demand curve. As soon as you force them to give up some aspect, any aspect of functionality, the demand collapses. And this, it leads to kind of an interesting dilemma, of course, is that the products that are giving them the ethics have to be as good as. In other words, they can't sacrifice on functionality. In other words, they can't force individuals into a functionality ethics trade-off. As soon as they do that, people seem to switch away from the functionality. And this varies across product category as well. Okay. Other examples of this, we did a series of experiments in coffee shops in which what we did is we posted, go into the coffee shop, like a Starbucks down in the city, and there would be a sign. And the sign says, "We have fair trade coffee, no extra cost, just ask for it." Okay? And what we did is we simply tracked the number of people who said, "Give me the fair trade coffee." Okay? And then what we did is we waited a couple weeks. And then we did the McDonald's thing, which was when they came to the cash register and they ordered the coffee, we said, "Do you know we have fair trade coffee? Do you want it? There's no extra charge." We tracked the number of people who said, "Yes, I'll take that." And then in the third part of the experiment, what we did is we posted another student experimenter behind the person asking the question. So that when I ask you the question, "Do you want the fair trade coffee?" there's somebody standing behind me looking at you while you're answering the question. Okay, and we just tracked what percent of people said, "We'll do it." Then what we did is we then, if you said, "I'll take the fair trade coffee," we gave you a different color cup than if you said no. And then we randomly went to people and we talked to them about fair trade and gave them a survey. You can almost expect what the outcome of this is. So this is the 3 experimental conditions. So brochures available at checkout, the things advertised, less than 1% asked for the fair trade coffee without prompting. In the situation 2, that number jumps up to 30%. In condition 3, it jumps up to 70%. What have we changed? Nothing. We've only changed context. Okay? We've taken their privacy away in terms of making the decision. We've changed the context. And when we actually did the survey part of it, there's no difference between the people who said yes and the people who said no. Okay? There was no material difference between what they were doing. Okay? I'll skip all the rest of this because I don't think it needs to be done. But there are a whole series of other things, the experiments which basically replicate a lot of this, which are related to things like organics. So rather than asking people whether they want to purchase organics or don't want to purchase organics, the experiments we ran, we actually looked at store design. So what we were doing is we were actually not asking them what they were doing, we were giving them different store designs, and we were looking at what percent of their basket they put into that was organic, right? So we put them into a virtual reality system, right, where they could go along and they could see the products along the wall, and then they would get different varieties of these, and then they could purchase them or not purchase them depending on what the information was that was being given to them. Okay, and what we found is basically that their sensitivity, their price sensitivity to this was a little bit higher within certain categories, but again, it wasn't overwhelmingly large. So what are some of the conclusions we can draw from this? This is broadly speaking, okay? So it doesn't come just from these examples. What we find is proximity matters. Individuals tend to focus much more on things that are material to them. In other words, if you can take the sustainability issue as an example of causes we give, and remove it from sustainability, but link it, for example, into children's education and their future, they behave differently. Okay, if you can take a pollution issue and make it a health issue, you get much more positive effect than you would otherwise get. Okay, so what you have to recognize that people have a tendency to materially act in the context that you create for them, but they also create the context themselves. Okay, attempts at demographics are very interesting here. In other words, there's a high variety of heterogeneity. I could give you example after example where you basically have a very hard time predicting who these people are without seeing something quite subtle about them. So this point that Kostas was making about there kind of isn't a simple rule to this. In terms of the marketing of it is really quite true. Naive segmentation doesn't seem to work. Context tends to be a huge issue. In other words, the quickest way to change people's behavior is not to try and change their values or their attitudes, it's actually to put them in context in which the behaviors are kind of driven, which creates a huge social engineering problem. And the last one, which kind of a bit, kind of probably going against context, and that is that I tend to ignore surveys and opinions. And that is that unless the surveys in some sense impose no trade-off cost on the individual. And because they impose no trade-off cost on the individual, you don't know how that's going to link into the nature of the behaviors that they are engaged in. There are a whole series of extensions of this. So it isn't just, I gave you the consumer example, but I'll just give you 3 more quick ones. We ran a series of experiments on about 7,000 people in several different countries on social investments. We put them into investment games so that they actually could move their pension money around. And what we basically found is we found that people underinvested in social investment funds over the board. Quite surprising to us. We didn't expect to see that. But when we talked to pension fund managers, they actually confirmed that that was what they perceived to be seeing. So people were basically discounting the social investment funds when there was actually no reason to discount them, which was kind of odd. Individuals put little value in social reputation of the firms. So recently the Financial Times had their best employer survey. We actually ran, again, a whole series of experiments in different countries on workplace social and environmental responsibility of companies, looking at how people chose job contracts, where to interview, et cetera, et cetera. And what we found is that unless the reputation of the company was linked to the human capital development of the employee, they basically ignored it. Okay, and this was also kind of counterintuitive in the sense that, for example, blue-collar construction workers didn't put any value on any of the social responsibility or corporate responsibility, anything. The MBAs actually did, lawyers did, because the reputation of the company affects their future human capital. The third one is that individuals actually can't even identify their own company's policies. This is a paper at Harvard Business Review, where basically what we did is we used quite a complicated sort of kind of way of doing this. But the question was, could companies identify their own underlying strategies and the policies of their company as distinct from the policies of competitors or random companies? And the answer was, fundamentally, they couldn't. They were slightly likely to be able to identify their corporate strategies, but everything else they seemed to have little knowledge about. Okay, and this goes back to the fact that what individuals tend to do is they tend to fixate on the local phenomenon. They tend to fixate on the things which are closer to them in some regards. Either it's their pension, it's what they're purchasing, it's their children's schooling, it's their their job. So one of the things that we showed in this last paper was the only time in which employees paid attention to the reputational aspects of their jobs is when it was in their last performance appraisal. So we actually have them talk about what were you evaluated on your last performance appraisal. If they were being evaluated on, for example, the environmental impact of their business, then they actually remembered what the company's policy was. If they weren't, it didn't matter to them. So basically, what do you make of this? And I have 3 kind of very simple ones. I'll give you the first 2, right? We must make the best of mankind as they are, since we cannot have them as we wish. Okay? And that is that it's very important to not try and idealize a lot of this. Andrew Carnegie, as I grow older, I pay less attention to what men say, and I look at what they do. So it's very important to kind of look at the context and the actual behaviors. And then my favorite at the end, that great philosopher Elizabeth Taylor, the problem with people who have no vices is generally you can be pretty sure they're going to have some annoying virtues. So in essence, the whole point of this talk is to kind of say, this is actually a quite complex, quite nuanced way of thinking about things. And when you look at this type of behavior, it's much, much more complex than simple purchasing behavior. It's very, very complex. It's different from normal labor behavior. It's different from normal consumption behavior. It's actually different from normal investment behavior. So you have to kind of understand the nature of the nuance. So with that, I'll stop and I'll turn over to Effie. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Effie Kesidou. I'm an associate professor of applied economics, and I will shift a bit now the last part of our debate on corporate social responsibility and draw your attention to state regulation, because the previous speakers, they have focused on consumer and consumer behavior, which is really very important in driving corporate social responsibility, but we shouldn't forget the state and regulation. So this research I will present you today focuses on state regulation and on one facet of corporate social responsibility. This is the environmental corporate responsibility. So the next 15 minutes, I will start with the background of this research project. I will continue with the literature. Then I will discuss the methodology that we applied. And finally, I will conclude with the results and the future research. So some important directions. So first, the background. In this research, we look at the relationship of environmental state regulation and environmental corporate responsibility. So very often, organizations are demonstrating the commitment to environmental responsibility by adopting environmental management systems. So environmental management systems are systems that are applied in organizations, that are formal procedures, and it is shown that they improve environmental performance. There are different ways that organizations can apply these systems. They are in-house environmental management systems, but there are also externally certified environmental management systems. Now, research has shown that environmental management systems improves the environmental performance of the organization, but also may generate some economic benefits. So there is a business case for the corporation, and not only the environmental case. So of course, before embarking into this project, we read the literature. So what the prior literature has said is not really clear. So there is one body of studies in line with the Porter hypothesis that argue that state regulation goes hand in hand with self-regulation. Self-regulation meaning that corporations voluntarily, they will commit to environmental responsibility. So voluntary, they will adopt these environmental management systems. So these studies and what Porter argue that this is a win-win situation. So when you have regulation in place, corporations will adopt these environmental management systems because they want to comply with the regulation, but also they will gain. How they will gain? They will gain because these environmental management systems, they will improve their economic performance. In other words, they will reduce the production cost because they will make savings. They will save the resources, they will save from energy and material use. So this is one line of research. In contrast, some other scholars argue that the relationship between state regulation and self-regulation might not necessarily be positive, might actually be negative. And why they argue that? They argue that in some environments, for example, they are heavily regulated environments, corporations, as before Timothy argued, they weigh the cost and the benefit to abide to corporate social responsibility. So they find that when they operate in heavily regulated environments, their marginal benefits on their production process or their legitimacy are negligible. So they might not actually abide to corporate social responsibility. Equally, when we find studies such as Podolsky and Prakash, they say that when corporations operate in a weak regulatory environment, they will increase the self-regulatory practices, they will abide by corporate social responsibility, and this is because their benefits, the marginal benefits, are much higher. So our research question is on this relationship. So we are asking in this research project whether state regulation drives and motivates corporations to adopt environmental management systems to commit to environmental responsibility, or rather we see the opposite, or rather we find that there is a negative relationship. Do self-regulations, environmental self-regulations, substitute state regulation? Do we see that there is a withdrawal of the state? Do we still need state regulation? So this is the research question we pose in this project. Okay, so after the more superficial touch upon the literature, we had to delve into the literature and look in depth at what the studies meant when they were talking about state environmental regulation. And what we found was state environmental regulation was acknowledged. There was a consensus that it is important, irrespective of whether it exerts a positive or negative impact. But most of these studies, they treated it as one-dimensional indicator. So in order to address this problem, we looked at the environmental economics literature, and we attempted to disentangle the complexity of environmental regulation. So environmental economics, there is a whole debate. They say, okay, regulation is very complex. There could be direct instruments, such as regulation, but maybe market instruments, such as taxes, they might be more effective in reducing pollution. So we use this, take into consideration both direct, indirect instruments, but also regulatory stringency. So regulatory stringency, actually recent studies, they argue that it might be more important because unless regulation is strict, these studies argue, green technologies might never be competitive, price competitive. The other shortcoming in prior literature is that they don't differentiate when they study self-regulation, and in particular environmental management systems, they don't differentiate between in-house and externally certified management systems. Is this a problem? Yes, it is a problem because they are different. So corporations, they may have an in-house environmental management system, but also they may certify this environmental management system with, for example, the most well-known certification systems are the ISO 14001 and the EMAS, the European certification. So these are different because the in-house EMS is not certified by a third party as the externally certified EMS. And also the motivation of corporations to adopt an in-house EMS and an external EMS, we find in the literature, are different. So corporations, they may adopt in-house EMS in order to improve the production process and to improve their efficiency. So they will have some economic gains. In contrast, we find that externally certified forms of self-regulation are adopted, are more costly, and also adopted for legitimacy reasons. Okay, so but this doesn't mean that these externally certified systems are just a marketing device. They serve a purpose, and the purpose is to correct market failures with respect to asymmetric information. So what I mean by this, for example, if a corporation is part of a global value chain, where national regulation is not really present, then this certification will give the signal to the collaborators that, yes, I am green, and you can collaborate with me. But still, we need to, so most studies, they focus on externally certified regulation, they don't take into consideration in-house, and we think that this is an important shortcoming because they are different, and we consider both of them in this research. So this is our model. We disentangle environmental state regulation. We say, yes, we will take into consideration direct instruments, indirect instruments, the stringency of the overall regulatory framework, and also we want to see what is the impact of regulation upon environmental self-regulation. And we take into consideration both in-house and externally certified EMS. Now you see, I have an arrow from in-house EMS to externally certified EMS, and this leads me to the methodology part, which I'm not going to spend a lot of time because it's a bit technical, but still a key point is, and a big shortcoming of previous literatures, is that prior studies that they model the adoption of in-house EMS and external certification, they model them as two independent decisions. As if, I'm making the decision whether I will adopt EMS or I will certify, which actually in practice, if you talk with consultants that they implement environmental management systems, these are not independent decisions. We say that these are interdependent decisions, so there is endogeneity in the external certification, and theoretically this is invalid to treat them as two independent decisions. So what we argue and what we do to solve this problem is that we need a nested econometric model at two stages, because the decision is sequential. At first step, I'm thinking whether to adopt an EMS. So I'm starting, the first step of implementation of EMS is to implement the environmental management system. Then there is a trial period and a monitoring where they will look at gaps between implementation and the requirements of environmental management system. They will address the gaps, and subsequently there is the certification, and their corporation will ask the auditor to audit the EMS. So we argue that this is a two-stage decision. The first step, as you see here in this econometric model, is whether, which has a dependent variable, the adoption of EMS, whether I will adopt the EMS, yes or no. And the second stage, once we control for this decision, we have whether firms, they will certify their EMS. So again, our data verifies this problem. We see that we have a full sum of 2,000 firms. First decision is whether I will certify, yes or not, and we see that 700 firms, they adopt EMS, not certified, in-house, whereas 1,300, they don't have any EMS in place. And from these firms that they have adopted in the first place the in-house EMS, it comes their second decision. They contemplate, should I certify it, yes or not? The data comes from DEFRA, the Department of Food and Rural Affairs in the UK. They conduct an environmental protection expenditure survey, a firm-level survey of manufacturing firms. And we have approximately 2,000 firms in our sample, which corresponds to 30% response rate. So this is our data. I'm just going to go through our variables. Environmental management systems is a binary variable. 35% of the firms in the sample, they have in place an environmental management system in the UK, but only 17, close to 18%, they have this certified. And these are independent variables: environmental regulation, binary variable, environmental taxes, again binary variable. Stringency, this is a measure, is not a binary variable, thank God. It's measured by abatement expenditure, how much corporations are spending on pollution, protecting the environment, on pollution expenditure over their total turnover. So this has been shown that it captures whether firms operate in an energy-intensive environment or not. Of course, we control the customers, because of course customers, as the previous speakers have said, play an important role for this decision of the corporations and for many other factors. This is our results. So we have different models. The first column, it measures the likelihood of environmental management adoption. The second, the likelihood of certification. And we see that environmental regulation, it increases the likelihood of environmental management systems adoption. So we see that the presence of environmental regulation will motivate corporations to adopt an environmental management system. And this result is consistent. However, we also find that the presence of environmental regulation deters certification. It exerts a negative impact. Because, of course, this is a survey and some of the variables are binary variables, we also use energy quantiles. We match the data with industry data just to have a closer look at how whether there are differences at the industry level. And we see, again, that firms that they are, here this energy quantile is the most polluting industries. We see that they are more likely to adopt an environmental management system, whereas firms at the least polluting industries are more likely to certify, implying that firms in the most polluting industries, they operate in a stricter environmental regulatory framework. So what these results tell us, what are the findings and which are the implications? They reveal that there is a relationship, in fact. State regulation drives environmental corporate responsibility, but the relationship is not simple. We see that that environmental regulation encourages some forms of self-regulation, such as in-house EMS, but deters the certification of these environmental management systems. Is this a problem? Yes, this could be a problem, and of course we can discuss further how we can increase the communication between state regulation and the corporate world. Future research should look closely at regulation, because regulation could be at the international level, could be at national level, could be at regional or at the council level. It could be using performance standards or other standards. So it's very complex and we don't know. Recent studies say that you need to have the right policy mix. But what is this policy mix? And also a closer look and more in-depth understanding needs to be given on this self-regulation. What is this self-regulation? So we disentangle certification from in-house EMS, but recent studies, they look even closer at the quality of the corporate environmental responsibility, at the maturity and completeness of the in-house EMS. Because, of course, many small and medium enterprises, they won't certify. Certification is very expensive, but they will apply an in-house EMS, and we need to understand how do they implement this EMS. So with that, I would like very much to thank you for your attention, and the floor is open to questions.
I'm going to sit down as well. We're now open to discussion. The discussion point that we were really trying to get at was related to the complexity and the trade-off that businesses have to make in this space. And I think probably the only answer we can come up with to all of this is it's complex and it depends. We're probably not terribly satisfying. But we're open to comments, questions. Yeah, John. We've got actually a mic somewhere. Yeah, use the mic, please, just for sound purposes.
Is that better?
Yep.
Tim, fascinated to see the what do consumers really do when you put them to the test. Question I've really got is, I absolutely buy the point that given a choice, if someone has to trade something off or pay something more for a green or sustainable solution, then it's not going to happen. That's been widely proven. Yeah. However, do you sense any sort of what I call longer-term brand loyalty building as a result of providing better answers from a sustainability standpoint? I mean, is that the real business value here, brand loyalty?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, we'll do other questions and then we'll try to kind of package these up. Yeah, we've got one up here as well. Just get the mic.
Mine's just a supplement to that, Tim, really. It seemed sustainability is often thought of as a sort of rather a middle-class game. And if we use sort of substitute education as a proxy for middle class, you seem to indicate that wasn't particularly the case, and you couldn't start making generalizations about which way people would jump. I just wonder if you could expand on that a bit.
Okay. Other comments, questions? Yeah? Do you want to start, Costas, and then I'll follow on? Do you have a response? Okay, you don't want to. Do you want to? Let me make 2 points. I thought you were going to actually ask me a more complicated question, John. The complicated, one of the interesting questions that I was asked, which I haven't done academic research on, but it's been consulting related, is all the studies we do are opt-in studies, in some sense. You know, will the consumer opt into something? One of the real questions is whether consumers will opt out if you put something forward to them. So, for example, most coffee shops now are fair trade. Very simple reason: companies don't want multiple supply chains. You know, their view is pick one or pick the other, but don't operate two. If they switch to one, will people object? And the answer to that question is at least in the stuff that we've done, is no. That in some sense, the context of putting them, in some sense, the context of removing that choice from them, even with the price, isn't the same as having the current choice and increasing the price. Okay, so in other words, because remember, everything here is higher price versus lower price, option in, option out. If everybody switches to the new option and it's more expensive, the question is, do the market dynamics change? And the answer to that question is fundamentally not, at least in the areas we work, not that much. And so you go back to Effie's point. It may actually be in the company's interests for them to all get together and say, this is actually something we should do, and therefore we either have that regulation imposed on us in some form because we've got a free rider problem, or we self-regulate and we come up with a set of rules and we all abide by those rules. You know, so I think that there's a complexity associated with that aspect. As to the longer term aspect of it, this is a tough one simply because you don't have enough longitudinal data to be able to do this. But one of the things that you know, maybe Costas will come in on this one. One of the things that is well known in the marketing literature is related to sort of kind of habitual stickiness. In other words, if you can get individuals to engage in habits, in other words, routines, they tend to stick with those routines. So if in some sense you can do that, then it's beneficial. And we've always made the argument, at least as a practical point on the work that we've done, that if you want to get individuals to move to, let's say, a more sustainable position, don't try to beat them to death that they're, you know, you're a bad consumer. It's what I call the Al Gore model, you know, where you do a mea culpa and you say you're bad because you pollute the environment. What we say is change the context of the purchasing behavior iteratively. So it's a bit of a nudge solution, but then reinforce so that you can capture that in some way, shape, or form. And what that does is that reinforces a new heuristic model on the consumer, right? Because consumers don't make the rational choices in a complete way. What they do is they make a heuristically based choice, and therefore you would want to be able to do that. But to go back to the loyalty to the loyalty one, in one big study we did on fair trade coffee, was one of these big data studies. We had 16 million consumers. And we ran experiments in a number of different grocery stores across a country, a small North European country. And we varied where the products were located, where the labeling was, what the prices were, promotions, and everything. And what we found is that the fair trade labeling actually created a little bit of stickiness in the loyalty, but not a huge amount, but enough that was noticeable to the company to change a bit of their policy. You know, so this goes back to an early point, and that is that the behavior here is quite complicated. It's not just, you know, completely utilitarian. it falls into the same category of all the non-tangible assets. Satisfying somebody's well-being, satisfying their feelings about themselves, making them emotionally well, making them feel that their ethics is good, is actually bundled in as one of the kind of intangible components of the brand. And everybody knows that that's an extraordinarily hard thing to manage. And I think this is where we run into this big dilemma, and that is how you do that. In terms of Costas, yeah.
One of the issues that you raised is about brand and brand value, and whether we see consumers evaluating brands that are more sustainable in a better way, which, according to our research, not this one, other research we do, it pays off. There are brand reputation and brand performance effects. If you are more sustainable, have a better sustainability performance,
Yeah.
or you communicate what you're doing to your stakeholders. Whether the answer lies in between brand and performance, whether brand is the mediator in this case, it might as well be. So a number of companies are investing in sustainability and changing their marketing and strategy to operate in a more sustainable way, and they win in that way based on brand reputation returns. But importantly, in many cases, organizations, because they understand that sustainability and consumers is all about decisions. You go to a supermarket, you go to a grocery store, you're faced with a number of decisions. Do I buy this? Do I buy that? What are the calories for this? What are the nutritional values for that? What are the sustainability benefits of this? So a lot of decisions, and we as consumers have limited time to make these decisions. So in many cases, organizations are engaging in choice editing. And this is something that consumers want more and more, for the big organizations to edit the choice and present to them all the choices that are more sustainable, better for them, better for the environment, better for the society, etc., etc. Regulation, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, that's, it's open to interpretation, because we keep talking about we want more regulation. We want more regulation, for instance, to influence certification. But a lot of people disagree about regulation. They believe that the market should be left as it is, and to operate in a free way. So it's still open to debate as to whether we want more regulation or we need to allow the market to operate in a free way, in a self-regulatory way. But one thing's for certain, when it comes to sustainability and try to understand consumers, generalizability is an issue here. You cannot generalize and say, this is the case for each and every one in every different country. Our study, for instance, showed different effects in terms of values, in terms of behavior. And that's one of the reasons we stayed away from specific outcomes, such as purchase intention, such as brand preference, and we opted to something much more macro in terms of perspective, which is quality of life. So they cannot lie about how they're feeling about their life. They don't have any motivation to lie. If they feel good, they're going to say it. If they feel bad about their life, they're going to say it. It was an anonymous study, so we're pretty confident about that effect, at least. But when it comes to generalizations, this is one of the problems. And we need to look at specific situations. We need to look at the decision making at the point of purchase. And we need to understand all the different set of variables that inform consumers and help consumers make decisions at the point of purchase.
Effie?
I don't. So my research is not about consumer behavior, so I don't have things to contribute towards that. But following from Kostas about regulation, so that's what I have been studying, and environmental performance. So I hope that the message was clear. We do need regulation. It's not a discussion, because if we want to transition to a greener economy, regulation is crucial for that. Why is that? This is because it has been shown that in technological innovation, technologies are path dependent. So there are green technologies, they will never be competitive and they will never be adopted. So all the green technologies that are currently competitive, they come from countries that the regulatory framework help producers to start production and achieve the eventually the economies of scale, make them competitive. Which were these countries? Germany, Scandinavia, and they are the forerunners in producing these green technologies. So my message is that we do need regulation, but also state regulation needs to, the institutional framework, co-evolve with the corporate world. So they need to communicate, and in the case of the ISO 14000, the certification, for example, what could be done is to provide a relief, regulatory relief to those corporations that they certify, so as for them to increase their benefits and be able to make this decision. So we need a better and closer relationship between regulation and corporation, but regulation is really important in this transition to sustainability, environmental sustainability in particular.
Yeah. I think one of the things that is always intrigued me about this work is the fact that you can't believe what people say. And so for example, if you think about a policy initiative, and you go to individuals and you say, well, do you think that we should regulate for a better environment? Yeah, sure, why not? Should university tuition be free? Yeah, no, why not? Should professors be paid more? Yeah, why not? Because there are no consequences of responses to those. And one of the things that I mentioned at the end has to do with this proximity effect. And one study we did, which is on my blog site, were studies that we did in the United States, Australia, Germany, the Czech Republic, Spain, a number of other places. And what we did is we asked people a whole series of questions which were related to things like the global development goals and other things like that. So we asked people, what they thought was important to them. Civil rights, third world debt, all sorts of things. And one way we asked them is we asked them on a simple things, on a 1 to 10 scale, how important are civil rights to you? How important is poverty to you? How important is your children's schooling to you? And what you find is everything's important to everybody. But what we then did is we then put them into trade-offs. So what it says, here's a pot of things. There are 5 issues on the table. To keep the one you want, you've got to take one away, and you'll never see it again. Completely changes the responses. Completely changes. And this is where the proximity effect comes in. Every single country you looked at, health, children's schooling, taxation not so much, but it's up there, right? What's at the bottom? Things like third world debt, ethnic cleansing, things which are kind of on TV but at a distance, right? And what's in the middle? Things like environmental sustainability, right? They're basically in the middle. And so one of the questions is, well, what does that tell you? What that tells you is if you go to people and you say, you should be much more environmentally focused, you should care more about human rights, okay, when you're in a thriving democracy, right? Well, you don't worry about that, okay? What that means is if you want people to care about that stuff, you actually have to reframe it in amongst the things they care about. All right, so when we've done work with sustainability NGOs and other things like that, we've said, don't beat the sustainability bandwagon. Talk about people's schooling, the quality of their life, like Costas was, all of those things which are materially top of mind to them, okay? Because any policy you go out and ask about, companies will respond to this. And I'll give one good example of this, right? You go into Starbucks now and you'll see the calorie counts. How many people think people use that information? Right? And the answer is nobody uses it. Okay, there was a enormously well done study by George Lowenstein and Sally Dons, where what they did is when New York passed those regulatory changes, 6 months before they passed the changes to put these calorie labels on fast food, they collected people's receipts, what they had for lunch. They surveyed them on a whole series of things. And then what they did is when the regulations came out and everything changed, they looked at what people were still eating. And lo and behold, they were still eating the same stuff they ate before. You know, and then there were follow-on studies that said, well, maybe it's a long-term thing. Let's look 2 years later. Still no change. Let's look 3 years. Right? And one of the questions was why did the New York Department of Public Health pass that law? Well, when they were presented with the evidence at a press conference, the person said, well, yeah, maybe those are the results of the study, but we still think we did the right thing. What was their policy based on? This goes back to my point. It was based upon bad information. Okay? And I think this is one of the real concerns where you come down to the regulatory thing, right? Regulations will change context and they'll change behavior. But they can change it easily for the worse and waste a lot of money. So all these fast food stores now have calorie labels on them. What's really the impact of that? Would a better regulatory structure have been to do it in a different way or to do it in some other means, which would have led to a different outcome, you know, and maybe that means is actually what you do is you tax calories. You know, I mean, in other words, that might actually change things much more materially because who are the people who change the context? It's actually the intermediaries, right? It's the stores selling you the stuff, and you want them to actually create a context in which the consumers would behave differently. But just getting them to be regulated to put a label on there, what they'll do is they'll slap a label on there. If they don't see it materially affects their business, then they won't change the composition of their products, which means the regulations fail because they don't actually address the fundamental problem. You know, so then you have to think about a different solution to that. You know, and it may not be the most obvious solution. Yeah, it may be things like in the case of cigarettes, you simply ban it in workplaces, or you do things which are pretty blunt. But it turns out that it's actually easier and cheaper and more effective to ban it than it is to tax it. And, you know, even though it has its counter effect. So you end up with this oddity in that sense. Okay, I don't know if you want to make any comments on that. No? Any one more question? It'd be it. One more quick one.
Right, thank you very much.
Sorry.
I really love the point about cost effectiveness.
Yeah.
Okay, I guess it's not working. So my point is, my question is, we spend a lot of time talking about whether firms need to do the right thing or whether government needs to make them do the right thing. But then if you look at it from another angle, it's perhaps because the solutions aren't there. You know, if someone can come up with a nice sandwich which is healthy and which is good and cheap, perhaps people will use it. So my question is, what happens to the work of developing those kind of solutions while most of the conversations tend to focus on what the government needs to do and what companies themselves need to do. So what do you think about that?
That's you.
Me?
Yeah. You've been quiet. Say something.
So say again, what is your question? So no government.
It's about innovation.
It's about people, right?
It's about innovation.
It's about innovation. So how do you think that could emerge? You know, how can the solutions of the future start coming when focus tends to be either on innovation or companies? Maybe none of those.
I think all stakeholders, they need to participate, and there are different levels, right? So there is the international level. International organizations, they are putting some regulatory frameworks, national levels regulation, the corporation, the individual, as Timothy and Kostas was saying. But a lot of this type of radical changes in behavior. So radical changes in behavior, I don't know so much about that, but what I know is radical changes and innovations in technology. So for that, I do know that you need to provide subsidies to make these technologies cost competitive. Otherwise, they will never be competitive. We will never make the choice of a clean or a more ethical, in my view, or more greener product if it is extremely expensive. So we need government to intervene for this. Behavioral-wise, again, I think there is a role for the government with respect to education. So education starts teaching about environmental behavior, about well-being, and about ethical behavior. So I see that maybe the regulation it has different parts, right? They may coordinate the different stakeholders, but also schooling and education may alter, and the next generation may have a completely different behavior than ours. But still, as an economist, believe that with respect to the production process, not the demand side, that regulation is pivotal to make green technologies sustainable and competitive.
Okay. Anything to say?
I agree with you that people need to look at sustainability and innovations from the customer's point of view, but also there is a need to involve different stakeholders in producing products, in presenting solutions for everyday customer problems. It's not important to provide a healthy sandwich. It's even more important to provide a healthy and good tasting sandwich. To come to your example, I get it. This is really important, but on the other hand, you cannot get from 0 to 100 within a day. It takes time for knowledge and technology to catch up and allow you to come up with something that is going to be 100% likable by customers. We know in the sustainability literature that there is some kind of convenience, but also some kind of compromise when it comes to sustainability products. The issue is to avoid this compromise and make it 100% convenience for the customers. For instance, looking at the electric cars, we know that some people feel very, that electric cars are quite inconvenient, for instance, in terms of how you can recharge, how much it takes to recharge your car, etc. However, I was reading yesterday that there is research from universities showing how they can limit down the charging time for the car and make the range of the car to be equal to conventional cars, making sure that that particular product, for instance, is comparable, convenient, and there is no compromise in using that. Yeah. So this is the things that we need to push forward, but we need to understand that it takes time, slow steps, and we can get there eventually.
Yeah. Let me just make one last comment, and then we'll conclude. Look at the work of Dawn Siegel and Abby McWilliams. Probably now 15 years. Basically, what they argue is that CSR is fundamentally about innovation. So essentially, it's a different business model logic. Okay, and where you see it applied more often is in startup firms rather than large multinationals, because large multinationals already have systems which work, and also it's very hard for them and very costly for them to switch systems. Therefore, the people who will experiment and will be more entrepreneurial are small firms, and because those firms want to not only compete on products, they want to compete on business models. They want to say, I've got a different way of production, I've got a different way of using supply chain, I've got a different way of satisfying the customer, as opposed to saying, well, I've got 1 billion customers and I've got to change the behaviors of those 1 billion customers. So if you look at the literature, there's a lot on that. And in some sense, that's, I think, more amenable to many companies because it speaks to a natural things they want to do. With that, we're over. I can see Charlotte there looking at me saying we've got to move on. Thank the speakers, which includes me, I guess. So thanks a lot, and enjoy the rest of the day. You now have lunch over in the Great Hall. There's some poster sessions over there. You can talk to some of the PhD students, and you can get a free lunch. It's a university lunch, but it's a free lunch nonetheless. So thank you, everybody.